Welcome to DAO Talk. Today we have Gustav Arentoft, who is one of the founders of StableLab. StableLab is a professional delegate organization in the DAO governance space and is really pushing the boundaries of DAO governance and helping us move forward to make DAOs better. So super excited to dive into StableLab with Gustav today, and we'll touch on some key hot topics that are happening in the DAO world, including delegate compensation. So hope you enjoy it. Gustav, welcome to DAO Talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, frisson, and I really appreciate being here today and hope that I can provide some insights into what is going on and what we're working on.
Heck yeah. So maybe you can just get us started by telling us a little bit about your background, kind of how you got into working in the crypto DAO space, and talk a little bit about what you're working on now at StableLab.
Yeah, so I think I've always had a passion for technology. I built my first computer when I was 11 years old and spent a lot of time playing video games when I was younger. And this kind of converted into me still enjoying spending a lot of time in front of the computer, just doing other things. I really like the technology behind Bitcoin, behind the blockchain. So I played around with it a little bit back in 2012. Ran a node, a Bitcoin node, and was not really doing too much, just more from an interest standpoint to see how everything worked. Then fast forward 5 years, I was living in Argentina in 2017, and went from I got paid in pesos. I started my career in Argentina, and I studied software development and economics. So kind of a pretty good path into the crypto space, as I think those are probably two of the main components of the technology, at least part of it. Economics are involved a lot. And then I was living in Argentina and, was paid in pesos and was exchanging pesos to dollars in, fake storefronts and back alleys and just completely random. I met a guy who was running a local OTC business and ended up living with him. And that kind of pushed me towards rethinking everything I was doing. And then around 6-9 months later, I joined MakerDAO full time. So I joined them in 2018, spent around 4 years at Maker. So was pretty much involved in DeFi from the beginning when I kind of fully joined crypto. Before this, I was doing consulting for financial technologies in emerging markets. That was what I was doing in Argentina. We had some blockchain projects, but as you can imagine, a company is kind of staying on the peripheral. It was not really kind of satisfying enough. So then, I spent 4 years at Maker. I've also been a core contributor to 1inch. So it's been very involved in DeFi and has kind of experienced, at Maker, how we went from being a centralized foundation into a fully operational DAO. And when that happened, that was the point when me and my co-founder, Duwan, who also spent around the same time at Maker, we joined 1 month apart. We decided to launch first Stable Node and then later on StableLab together. Whenever we were talking with any projects or protocols, it was really everyone was asking for our input on governance, even though that was not necessarily always what we tried to talk with them about. So around 9 months into launching StableNode, we decided to really focus on governance. So that's kind of what we've been doing for the last year and a half now. And today we work with 24 protocols. We work with most of the major DeFi DAOs, such as MakerDAO, Aave, Compound, Uniswap, 1inch, Balancer, Euler. We also work with some of the L2s like Optimism, Arbitrum, Starknet, and also Ronin. We work with a couple of NFT projects as well. And kind of our ethos around who we work with is mostly that, for our methodologies to work, kind of the way that we view governance, we need to have some kind of financial primitive involved in the decisions. And I think especially this shines through in DeFi, where, of course, a bad vote could have disastrous outcomes for the protocol and the end users. So this is really where you need a lot of methodology and framework in the decisions when they're being executed. That is kind of what we are specializing in. We are one of the leading professional delegate organizations out there, and we really try to be as hands-on as possible. We also sit on various councils and committees across the board where we work. We're also governance facilitators in a couple of protocols. On top of that, we also kind of like feel like it's important to stay up to date with the research and the trends. So we also have like our internal research team. With them, we build DAO Meter, which is a governance maturity index, where we basically kind of try to take a crack at being able to analyze how mature a DAO is based on certain implementation features of them, basically being able to reflect the amount of responsibility that the community has taken over from often the foundations, but of the project, of the protocol. So I think that was kind of like a generalized overview. We are governance nerds, and we really enjoy kind of like being this kind of like, new era political organization working in DAOs.
I'm really excited to talk with you because you have such a plugged in and broad view of the entire protocol DAO ecosystem, which ends up being our focus as well at Tally, because we kind of focus on governor and on-chain governance specifically, and protocols are the ones that are most likely to have on-chain governance. There's a very, very high overlap between all the organizations you just named and the sort of power users of Tally. So super excited for this conversation. So I guess I'm very curious what you've learned about being a professional delegate specifically. So, I think like at Tally, we really believe in delegation as a primitive for DAOs, and we also believe in on-chain governance, but we think there's still work to do to sort of make it like a home run, right? For DAOs and for the ecosystem. Definitely one gap is kind of like professionalism, right? It's like, and that doesn't mean every delegate needs to be part of a professional delegate organization per se, but I think bringing some level of specific expertise to the table as a delegate is actually pretty critical versus just sort of being a famous person or something like this. It's not that we like famous people too, but we want them to have some sort of actual expertise they're bringing to the table in the specific DAO they're a delegate in. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. What does it mean to be a professional delegate? Where have you kind of found your niche in sort of providing specific value to the DAOs that you work with?
Yeah. So, I think when we kind of started looking at being a professional delegate, we were kind of testing out in a couple of organizations. One of the first ones was Maker. Within I think 5 months, we ended up being the biggest delegate there. We also started working quite early with, for example, Balancer. And from kind of being part of a DAO, working for the foundation for so many years, we kind of started at, from the point, what would we want from a delegate, right? We kind of believe that this doesn't apply to all delegates, but there was some delegates that were not up to kind of the professional standards or kind of the participation level that we think a delegate should be coming with, right? So we unfortunately saw quite a bit of bias going into the delegates' decisions, and kind of people approaching being a delegate more as kind of a job, right? We work for the DAO, in some cases we get paid, but kind of with this, there's a really big difference between working for a protocol, where everyone else participating is your colleagues and friends, and then being kind of a decision-making organization who should really remain kind of unbiased and neutral in their position. So we started by saying, okay, what we believe, that DAO governance is kind of reminding us of is more like nation-state political structures. So we started kind of by drafting out, we have a set of policies, we have a code of conduct, we have our ethics and values, similar to how if you're a member of a political party, you believe in certain things. So you can kind of know that, maybe not in the US because you have very broad political parties there, but in other parts of the world, we have more specialized political parties. For example, in Denmark, I think we have 12 right now sitting in the government. That basically means that whoever you're talking with, they would often share very similar perspectives and views on the topics, right? So we basically said, okay, it shouldn't matter whether it's me or Du or, one of our delegates, Matt Kine or something, or Naomi, for example, who participates. We should be able to have a uniform approach, right? And we should be believing in the same thing. So kind of trying to align ourselves internally was really important for us at first. So, we kind of can create an expectation to, who we are. And it's not we will if we have like a similar topic, we will vote in East one day and the West the next day. We kind of like want to make sure that like we are kind of like more streamlined around the process. So kind of like trying to add a level of like professionalism, which is, an expectation to, how we are behaving. That was kind of like one of the first things. And then, of course, like, we are learning a lot still every day. There's so much stuff going on. And I think also like, we kind of like try to also, we have definitely also like come across a lot that, there is sometimes like a little bit of like friction on like how the direction of the DAO is going, what is the scope of the DAO. So like what we definitely like try to specialize in mostly at the moment is kind of like framework building for the protocols, right? So, if we come in, at a protocol in maybe like the earlier stages, we saw quite a few projects, almost everyone actually, who was in this stage that, they had quite a mature product, but an immature DAO, right? So then at this point, you can kind of like say, okay, the product has mode, but the DAO needs to kind of like figure out how to operate. So we work a lot with operations, right? I think like there's some tooling which is definitely like necessary. Like something like what Tally provides is definitely like very necessary for protocols that kind of like need this kind of like voting mechanisms and being able to conduct on-chain governance because it's complicated to build yourself, and especially in the beginning, not everyone want to go like the route of Maker where they build a custom module. So basically, we kind of like see a lot of people trying to approach, DAOs being like a technical problem. We don't believe it is. We believe it's an operational problem. It's an organizational problem. So that is what we are working with. We work with framework building, implementing methodologies, trying to kind of like gradually enable the community to take on more responsibility. Our mindset around this is basically that, like the maturity of a protocol, like the centralization of a protocol, is directly tied to the responsibility that the community can take. And basically that means that if you implement something that gives the community more responsibility, then you need to grow the community until actually fulfilling that responsibility. Once that is fulfilled, you can kind of like take the next step. So it's kind of this like step-by-step process where, over time you're able to hand off more and more responsibility to the community. And then of course, like the end goal is that the community has the full responsibility of the DAO itself. But that is not always what the protocols want. But that's kind of like some of the things that we are like focusing on and how we kind of like see this space progressing.
It's somewhat paradoxical where the process of decentralization, especially social decentralization, which I think is part of what you're talking about, it actually requires structure, right? This is something I'm trying to think about a lot myself. Especially since Tally's been more involved recently in DAO launches, how like there's some level of structurelessness, which I think is necessary. Like if there's a centralized party that comes in, especially one that's somehow like represents the team and says like, this is how the DAO works, that is maybe it's beneficial operationally to some degree, but it also kind of like quashes some of it kind of creates like a local maximum for social decentralization in a lot of ways. But then on the flip side, if no one does anything, which is like theoretically optimal for decentralization, right? Where it's just kind of like someone has to just start doing something completely on their own, like out of like cold, right? Cold start. What ends up happening is like, it's hard for people to figure out how to contribute, right? Because like not everyone can just be like, yes, I know exactly what to do and I know how to sort of like marshal the resources to get a proposal across the finish line, et cetera. So there's some balance there where like, you don't want to be too heavy-handed, especially if you're like the team that already has all the like social capital influence, but like you need some structure. So I think I can see the benefit of having a professional delegate organization try to like help add some of that structure. I'm curious, like, maybe particularly with the launch, like during that like launch phase of DAOs or like immediately after the launch, where have you seen, the benefit of like some of your methodologies kind of helping activate that level of social decentralization in the DAO?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like one of the first things that we kind of like try to identify together with the foundations when we work with them is kind of like, what is like the desired scope, right? And also like, where do you want to end up? And then often people say, hey, we want to be able to hand off everything. I'm like, yeah, that's great. But like, what if we say like the next 3 to 6 months, right? Like where do you actually want to be moving in that time period? So it's kind of like, you try to define like what is like the immediate goals for the foundation themselves, because they're often the ones who's kind of like setting the pace, right? Once we kind of like lock in on that, then we can start defining the scope of the governance. So like in the beginning can start with something very simple, like, we want to give, grants, or, we want to, decide what to do with our treasury. That's kind of like the two, easiest, like low hanging fruit of like, okay, let's do some kind of like coordination where we have like an achievable outcome without, pushing too much towards the DAO. And then, what we work a lot with is kind of like trying to build out processes, and some of it is just very simple, right? Like we've, for example, seen that like in a lot of protocols when we come in, you can submit votes any day of the week, right? That's great. But, if you have like a 3 or 4 day voting period and someone submits a vote on Friday, it could be clashing, right? So we try to kind of like put like just like processes and formal structures in place. We also work sometimes on writing out like a constitution for the DAO, where we basically create kind of like the scope of like what you can and cannot do. Because of course, this is like another thing, if you just say, okay, it's a blank canvas, you can do anything you want. That can also become problematic, right? I think this is kind of like one of the issues we saw at Maker, where Maker basically said, you can do anything you want. So people started doing anything that they wanted, right? The problem is that like whenever you add functionality to the governance process, whenever you add something, this requires additional operations, right? It requires you to vote on it. It requires you to discuss it. It requires you to take a stance on it. It requires you to kind of like pay attention to it, right? So if you have something which is a completely blank canvas, and especially like a more well-funded DAO, like a DAO that actually has revenue, you can also be in the position where it just kind of like grows to the size where, it becomes operationally unfeasible for the community to actually handle it, because, you don't differentiate between what people should be doing. So then all of a sudden, you're taking away a lot of time from core contributors, delegates becomes, flooded with things to do. So for example, like with Maker, when we started with them, we kind of like take track of like how much time we spend on each DAO to kind of like pay a lot of attention to the optimization of the processes frameworks, right? So when we started Maker, it was around 12 to 14 hours per week. By the end, before the end game plan launched, it was around 25 to 28. So this is of course like a really big, increase in like hours you're spending on governing the protocol, and therefore, it might sometimes make sense to at least say, okay, we can add stuff to the canvas, but let's start with a canvas of this size, So we're trying to like help them define and scope what could be like feasible. Of course, we do most of the work, but kind of like getting these pointers from the DAOs themselves and like the teams is like an important kind of like stepping stone in the initial process. And yeah, like I think, another thing is also, which I should probably mention, is like, we're kind of like a little bit also in a funny part of the space, because we need our competitors and they need us. If it's just StableLab being a delegate, then it doesn't really work out. We actually need, some of the other delegate organizations to kind of like be there alongside of us. Another thing, like big learning and takeaway we have found is that, being like a delegate, it's becoming more and more difficult for an individual to do. And the reason for this is that, being a delegate, probably it like requires you to be a generalist, right? There's a lot of different topics being discussed in the DAO, and like, like if you're just like a specialist, the chances are that you are unable to participate in like a lot of the topics, right? So it requires like someone who is more like a generalist, who, is able to work both on the, let's say like security, technical implementations, product vision, strategy, business, growth, marketing. Like you need to take decisions on a lot of these different fields, right? Treasury management. Yeah, there's like so many topics that the DAO operates, right? So kind of like our approach to this is, we have like our delegates, but we try to also hire people who has like certain specialties, like strength. So we can kind of like, pull resources internally, like move them around as we encounter, the variety of problems that we see in like our day-to-day work as like a governance participant, right? I hope that we see more frameworks that kind of like cater more towards like the specialist people, right? I think Maker's endgame plan, we are following this very closely and super excited to kind of see what's happening there. It's the first time where like a major protocol is doing something really innovative with their governance. So I believe that it will work out, but this is something that we think is super exciting. Little sidetrack, but basically, like we're trying to add these like specialty resources internally, so we kind of like can pull on each other's strength once we encounter like a variety of different problems.
That makes a lot of sense. The idea of needing to have the ability to be generalist, especially at the highest level of the DAO. Maybe there are working groups or committees where it makes sense to be a specialist. But if you're trying to just like really help, craft proposals at the highest level of the DAO or review existing proposals, like, yeah, you definitely need to have that capability to really add value to a variety of things. Yeah, also makes a lot of sense. Like you kind of need an ecosystem of delegates. I think, yeah, this is probably an interesting way to bridge into a topic I really want to discuss a little bit with you, which is delegate compensation. So it's like, it's very interesting, right? Like if you think about a protocol where there's a DAO and the objective is to be decentralized but also get things done. You kind of need you need people to step up and like provide value to the DAO, which involves like some level of decentralization of resources inevitably, right? It's like, if I'm doing something, like the DAO needs to commit something, right, to me. But there needs to be that like balance of like multiple actors, right? Because if there's like one organization that is doing everything, they've basically just captured the DAO, which is like problematic for a variety of reasons, but like one that I think is underappreciated is other people stop doing things, right? So even if you don't have like a legal or moral problem with someone capturing the DAO, as soon as there's like one service provider that does everything, all the incentive for anyone else to contribute to the DAO is now gone, right? And that's even true in specific areas, right? So let's say you have multiple working groups and there's like one service provider that does everything in one of the working groups. Well, now like you're never going to get anyone else to contribute, right? And it's sort of like, this is like governance capture, right? Because if you're the solo provider and like you're now also voting on where the funds go, right? It's kind of like there's this path to very rapid governance capture, and so like there's a tension there, right? And like as a space, we need to figure out how to like pull that tension apart and like figure out how to execute, within that. And so I think delegate compensation is like a really key part of this discussion, because like ultimately DAOs need organizations like StableLab to do things for them, right? And also that are like impartial and not part of the core team, et cetera, et cetera. And like you're never going to get StableLab could never be sustainable. Even an organization like Tally, which is more like providing tooling, right? Like we need to sustain ourselves as well, not necessarily as delegates, but as like some kind of service provider to the DAO. So there needs to be compensation, right? But I think it's tricky with delegates, right? Because it's like, how can the DAO make objective decisions about how to compensate delegates if delegates are also the ones that are that are making the decisions? So this is something we're like trying to unpack, right, at Tally, because we think it's sort of like key, like delegate compensation, quote unquote, and also just compensation in a DAO in general while avoiding governance capture is sort of like the key unlock for DAOs to become, more productive, let's say, than centralized organizations. So would love to just like hear your thoughts. Like, how can we do this? How can we enable unlock compensation in DAOs?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's multiple aspects to this, right? If we just like start with like the delegate compensation part, right? I think this is like a little bit, it goes back to, what I mentioned earlier about like being like unbiased as a delegate and kind of like, having to like remain neutral, right? So this means that, like, for example, like us, we believe in lean governance, right? We don't think you should be like overspending in this current market on anything related to the DAO. So this means that, of course, if this is our standpoint, right, if delegate compensation comes on the table, we've on multiple occasions voted down the size of the delegation compensation, right? Because of course we cannot vote for like the highest tier of like delegate compensation if we are voting to cut budgets for like other, teams or core units, right? So I think like here, kind of like remaining unbiased is something which becomes crucial, right? And I think that, one of the reasons why you really want delegate compensation as well is that, for example, like us ourselves now, right? When we started working as delegates, delegate compensation was rare. It was only a couple of protocols that gave it. Now this is turning around, and we are kind of like in a position now where we can quite comfortably say no to a protocol unless there is some sort of like compensation on the table. Just because we are already like super busy, we get so much inbound. We have like protocol reaching out to us every single week who wants us to come in and work. But if that conversation ends in hey, we want you to do this for free, of course this is like unsustainable, right? And also can become like problematic. And another thing here, you mentioned a little bit about this like governance capture, right? And we've seen this happen also in some of the major protocols where you have, like delegate organizations like voting for themselves to take on, like really big parts of like the operations of the DAO. This we also think is like a problem. And I think like here it plays into like another one of our own ethics, which is, conflict of interest. So, again, it just comes down to kind of like how is like your organization structured, and I think that over time, at least I hope that we'll really see kind of like token holders and other like participants kind of like recognizing, okay, like if there's like a clear conflict of bias, right, like that's probably not like something you should be voting on or something you should be like taking like a standpoint to. And I like, for example, in Maker where there's kind of like this like, rule as part of like the governance participation where you had to declare like conflict of interest because, we've seen multiple organizations do this and we always call it out and this can create some drama, right? But I think it's like important that, we kind of like take a step back and understand our role in these protocols, right? Because, we're managing, the decision-making process in multi-billion-dollar protocols. Often delegates are the ones who are taking the decision from like end to end. So of course, you need to kind of like uphold yourself to like a certain standard. And this is kind of like what we believe that we will see like the space maturing more and more. And we hope that like, the more times people get called out for this type of behavior, like the better that they will be acting, right? And then in regards to kind of like, like operating, like implementations and things like this is like a delegate again, where there is, like some kind of like, benefit to themselves or like, adding things there. Right? I think it's also important that, as a delegate, your main objective is to do what's best for the protocol, right? Like, of course there can be something which benefit yourself and is still in the best interest of the protocol. I think delegate compensation is a topic around this as well. But like you kind of like need to always have this in mind, right? Like whatever you're doing should be the main goal should be to benefit the protocol. And when I mean the protocol, it's like what we talk about here from our perspective is, like a couple of like key things, right? It's like sustainability of the protocol and its resilience. That is like what we focus on, sustainability and resilience. Sustainability has a lot to do with, like the financial future and prospect of the protocol. Resilience also includes decentralization, but we want to build frameworks and ideas that could be here for many, many years in the future. And their resilience is really important. And decentralization is a really key component of resilience as well, right?
Absolutely. I think you did a really good job there of hitting on this topic from a bunch of different angles. I think fundamentally like delegate compensation is just necessary, right? So it's really more of a question of how it's executed than if it's going to be executed, because like you can kind of see the forcing functions towards delegation playing out in various ways, like you described, right? Like, as your organization grows, eventually you'll have the ability to sort of have influence over whether that happens in a DAO that you're getting involved in, right? And similarly, I think like, we kind of have, a very front row seat to a lot of the on-chain voting participation metrics at Tally. Just like, because I use the platform all the time, right? This is something I observe, and like, like just at the risk of oversimplifying it, like delegates that do not have some sort of like, it's tricky, right? Because you don't want delegates to be purely financially motivated. But if there isn't some sort of like clear reason for them to participate, either because they're getting compensated or for some other reason, like they just don't vote. Like like they just don't. They like maybe they vote in the first like two proposals because, you know, they were getting a lot of recognition on Twitter for like being a delegate, you know, during the like initial decentralization event, but eventually they stopped voting, like generally speaking. And so then if that's true, right, and you're saying, okay, it's important for the, you know, folks to sort of have some sort of incentive, you know, if it's not compensation for being a good delegate, then what is that incentive, right? And that might become more unclear and in ways that could create those conflicts of interest. So I think that's like another forcing function towards this sort of like clear compensation model on the delegate side.
There's like another thing here, which is like important to also mention, which is kind of like the social recognition of being a delegate. I mean, it is like something where you build up a lot of like reputation around you, right, and recognition as well. So there's like, of course, like compensation, financial compensation is one part, and you know, if we just quickly touch upon that, right? I mean, you know, DAOs are like willing to spend a lot of money on getting the best security audits, the best, you know, developers, the best marketing people, you know, all of these things. But you should also would want the best governance participants, right? And this is where like, you know, financial compensation becomes like crucial because like, of course, like in the short term, it might be like, okay for people to participate for free. But again, you know, being a delegate is a lot of work, right? You need to be very active. You need to actually like pay attention to everything. You need to write proposals. You need to actively engage. You need to help on like a variety of different fronts. It's not just voting, you know, like, and this is, you know, where like, especially like individuals, like us as an organization, we can kind of like sustain ourselves for like a while. But, you know, if you're like an individual and like, you know, the governance in the protocol takes like, let's say like around like 15 hours per week, you know, you have other things you could do with your time, right? You could spend time with your family, you know, you could work on another project that would pay you, you know, there's a lot of things that you could do with your time that, you know, would be, you know, giving you, you know, a different level of like, you know, personal gratification or personal reward, whether that's financially or socially or, you know, spending time with, yeah, family, right? But of course, there's this kind of like social recognition aspect as well in the DAO. But yeah, we should definitely like we should kind of like reward people for the time they spent, right? So I don't see like delegate compensation. It shouldn't necessarily be something like crazy always, right? I mean, I think like what we will see in the future is that like, you know, once we had these like fully decentralized protocols where delegates are like becoming such a key component of managing everything and like the process of like multi-billion dollar protocols where it is like really like a full-time job to just sit in this one protocol. I think we should also like reward people for that effort, right? Because, you know, then you need really smart people or really good organizations, and you know, you want the best. You know, you don't want people who could go next door and you know, take like a job that would, you know, be much more rewarding for them. Um, and then there's like kind of like the social recognition. It definitely gives like a lot, right? There's definitely, you know, like a lot of like other benefits as well to being like a big delegate in a protocol. It definitely holds like some level of like power, right? And also like, yeah, like recognition for kind of like your work. But of course, you know, this is like, as you said, like not necessarily like long-term sustainable, right? You need to also be able to fulfill like other parts of your life. And, you know, like the most important resource we have is time. And, you know, it just takes a lot of time to be a delegate. So, you know, you need to be able to make people prioritize. You need to be able to make people so that they can prioritize working in your DAO compared to doing a lot of other things in their life.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of time, I don't want to take too much of yours. So now is probably a good time to transition to our closing question. So the first one is a two-parter. It's what's your favorite part of working like as a professional delegate or in the crypto space? And then what's your least favorite part or something you think we need to work on as an ecosystem?
I think like my favorite part is just being able to kind of like, you know, work across the world with so many interesting people, right? Both at like my time at Maker and 1inch and also now at StableLab, right? You know, we work across like so many cultures that I never would have been able to connect with normally. So, you know, like at StableLab now, you know, we are 11 people and we have 2 people in the US, but the rest of the team is, from different nationalities spread all over the world. We have people in Africa and Southeast Asia, East Asia, Europe, and so on. So it's really like incredible to be able to kind of like bring so many different people from so many different backgrounds together and kind of like be able to push ideas and working towards like a common goal. And it's also amazing how many smart people there is in the space, right? So that's something I really like feed off, being able to have just like amazing connections and have this like, kind of like, feeling of belonging with so many other people to, whether that's like the goal of the governance space or, the goal of Ethereum as a blockchain or the goal of crypto in general. I think like bringing all of this together creates like a sense of belonging, and you work with a purpose, which I think is really important for me at least, and I think for a lot of other people. And then, yeah, one thing I think is, maybe, kind of like the same stuff, it is kind of like working a lot from home and working alone. So I really appreciate kind of like being able to take the social times together. We do 2 offsites per year internally, and we just had one here in Lisbon, where I'm located, in early May, late April. So that was just like incredible, and was really good. And then, yeah, I think that, I also would love to, see a little bit more diversity in the space. We're like trying, but it's really difficult. So, yeah, I hope that, also we see just like, more people from, also other backgrounds than we have right now coming into the space, and just like kind of like growing the amount of people with different backgrounds and genders who's like interested in the space is something that I really hope that we can do better in the future.
I love it. All right. And now it's time for our closing question. It doesn't have to be crypto related, but it can be, favorite place in the world could be MakerDAO. No. So what is your favorite place in the world and why?
Yeah. You told me that you would ask me this before we started, and I honestly have almost no idea what to answer. Yeah, I mean, I really like scuba diving and nature and kind of like being out on the ocean. So I think there's so many amazing places where I can do this. I grew up by the ocean myself, so I think that's why I have this notion. So I think like if I have to like look back on like some of like my best traveling memories, then I would say like places in Southeast Asia. Yeah, and not that they're the same countries, but like a lot of it is a little bit similar, in terms of like the vibe. So yeah, like somewhere where I can, scuba dive, preferably with some sharks, and go very deep, and yeah, then relaxing on the beach afterwards.
Amazing. I need to make it to Southeast Asia myself. The closest I've come is Nepal, which I feel like you're starting to get like a little bit of the flavor there. There's a lot of Buddhism and, people from other parts of Southeast Asia there, but definitely not the scuba diving part. So I need to go check that out. Awesome. Well, Gustav, thank you so much for coming on DAO Talk, and I will see you in the DAO streets, in the forums, on Tally. So I'll see you out there. Thanks for joining.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.